Hi, I'm Chris Batchelor with National Parents Organization, and today I'm here with Dr. Edward Kruk. He's an associate professor of social work at the University of British Columbia. He's also the inaugural president of the International Conference on Shared Parenting, which had a conference in Vancouver last December. That conference focused on the intersection of shared parenting and family violence. How are you doing today, Dr. Kruk?
Oh, I'm great. How are you?
I'm fantastic, and so tell us a little bit about the research that you presented at the conference.
Okay, well, the conference theme centered around the topic of the intersection of shared parenting and family violence, and looked at a range of issues in regard to this very controversial aspect of co-parenting. Is there a place for co-parenting when family violence has been or is an issue of concern? How do the two kind of relate to each other and intersect? And also, I talked a bit about parental alienation as a form of family violence, an unrecognized form of family violence. So I'm also president of the International Council, or rather, just as of yesterday, former president of the International Council on Shared Parenting that sponsored the conference. So yeah, I think the conference was a bit of a watershed in kind of understanding um, uh, the issues related to co-parenting in the context of family violence and addressing some of the myths and misperceptions about it. We drew close to 1,100 participants from over 50 countries. So, that really signals that this is an important issue worldwide.
Absolutely. And so, in that research, oftentimes domestic violence is not for shared parenting, and I think the conference addressed that in some significant ways. What are some things that came out of the conference?
Yeah. Well, I can talk a bit about, addressing some of the myths and misperceptions in this area. First of all, we ended the conference actually with a series of conclusions in regard to the present state of knowledge about family violence and shared parenting, and also some recommendations for legal kind of determination of parenting after divorce, best practices in the therapeutic realm, and policy changes that need to be made. But our first recommendation posed kind of focused on the question that's a subject of a lot of debate these days, and that is, should the issue of domestic violence be seen as kind of a gender specific issue and viewed as violence against women, or is it more of a gender neutral conceptualization? Like, and maybe we should be talking, rather than violence against women, more generally as partner abuse. So definitely when it comes to separation and divorce, where uh, children are concerned and family violence is an issue of concern, we concluded that just this very narrow focus on fathers as perpetrators of abuse and mothers as exclusively victims of violence really, when you closely examine the research literature, it doesn't, really, we should be um, looking at this gender paradigm under with greater scrutiny. It's kind of, we found it wanting in several respects because several papers that were presented kind of provided very clear data that about half of all domestic violence, partner violence, is reciprocal, and and that we've overlooked female to male violence. And that's a concern for family violence researchers. But at the same time, mothers and children are affected a little differently by family violence. And there's no denying that violence against women is a serious issue, especially during parental separation and divorce. And the impact of violence is more pronounced for mothers, because about two-thirds of people who are report being injured are women. And certainly during the coronavirus pandemic, lockdowns have left a lot of women trapped feeling trapped and exposed to greater danger, and all types of violence against women have intensified. So you can't kind of deny that violence against women is an important issue and can't be overlooked. But equally important is the issue of violence against men, and of course, violence against children. The issue of the effects of children witnessing spousal abuse is a really serious matter. It's the most serious, or rather, most prevalent form of substantiated child abuse, witnessing the abuse of a parent. Um, and it's one of the more serious forms of child abuse. Um, but one of the we kind of led off the conference with this statistic that fully 50% of first-time violence occurs during the separation and divorce period, where parents are disagreeing over the issue of custody, or parenting after separation. I don't like to use those kinds of outdated legal terms, but they're trying to negotiate parenting arrangements and come to some kind of an impasse, and then turn to the law for um, to in an attempt to resolve the issue and dispute. And they find that the law actually exacerbates conflict. It pits parents against each other. It's a highly adversarial system that's based on each parent denigrating the other and proving that you're trying to prove that they're the better parent. And during this time, the stakes are so high. Each parent is fighting for a meaningful relationship with their children, and it's within that highly adversarial system that a lot of first-time violence actually occurs when people's relationship with their kids are being threatened. So I think that's important to note, that if a shared parenting legal presumption were in place, people wouldn't have to fight over parenting arrangements. They'd know that they're equally valued and respected by the law, and that their relationships with their children will both be protected. You could prevent a lot of first-time violence through kind of establishing a legal presumption of shared parenting responsibility. Very few people realize that, yeah, fully 50% of first-time violence occurs within that adversarial contest, that legal system that pits parents against each other. That shared parenting is really highly preventive of family violence. So that was certainly one of the themes of the conference, really affirming that shared parenting is not only a viable arrangement, but really in the best interest of children and families, because it serves as a bulwark against first-time family violence. So we support a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting when there is kind of a contest over living arrangements. Shared parenting really needs to be the foundation of family law reform. But at the same time, we also had a consensus that although shared parenting is an optimal arrangement for the majority of children and families, including really high conflict families, it's really not appropriate. It's contraindicated in situations of substantiated domestic violence and child abuse. So at the same time, we're supporting a rebuttable presumption in favor of shared parenting, but rebuttable in cases of family violence, where it's been an issue of concern in the past and continues to be an issue of concern. But we also support a rebuttable legal presumption against shared parenting in family violence cases. And that's, often, we see particularly the legal system polarizing women and men, feminist groups and fathers groups, advocates for shared parenting, and family violence researchers, kind of dividing the two groups as being completely diametrically opposed from each other. That's actually not the case, because this idea of supporting a presumption against shared parenting in family violence cases, it's not incompatible with the idea of supporting a presumption, a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting in all the other cases where, the International Council on Shared Parenting is totally in accord with groups like the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges in the US, the National Association of Women in the Law. We all these groups agree that in every proceeding where there's at issue a dispute as to the parenting of a child, a determination by the court that family violence has occurred raises a rebuttable presumption that it's detrimental to the child, not in the best interest of the child, to be placed in a shared parenting arrangement, especially with a perpetrator of family violence. So, and we also concluded that family violence should be regarded as a criminal law matter, and barriers to criminal prosecution of perpetrators of family violence um, should be removed, and protection of victims of family violence and needs to be really emphasized, recognized, um, and um, recognizing that the criminal justice system does not protect victims of family violence as it should. It doesn't deal with the issue very often. It's in the family court where allegations are made. There's no fact finding or real investigation of what's going on in regard to abuse allegations. But very often it's the family court that deals with the issue rather than the criminal court where it should be addressed. Um, and finally, we kind of called upon child protection authorities to recognize children witnessing the abuse of a parent as a serious child protection matter, a serious form of child abuse, which needs intervention to determine whether a child is in need of protection from that parent, and immediate action to ensure children's safety and well-being. So, and we also included, of course, parental alienation as a common form of family violence in contested adversarial child custody proceedings. It's a serious form of child abuse, should be recognized as such by mental health professionals, by policymakers, by legal practitioners, by courts. Um, and one of our major conclusions was that, yeah, parental alienation is a particularly damaging form of both child abuse and parental alienation.
So I want to go back a little bit and unpack because you gave us a tremendous amount of information there. I'd like to go back and you had stated that in the case of where there's family violence that you don't recommend shared parenting, but then you also said that in 50% of cases the domestic violence starts during the custody proceedings, and so. Is there, I mean, it's not a black and white line, I don't think. I think there's some gray area there. Is there some guidance as far as, when you would and would not recommend shared parenting? I mean, obviously, if the children have been witnessing that trauma, then that's probably not a case where you'd have shared parenting. But what sort of guidance do you have on that?
Yeah, well, you're right. It isn't sort of there's a fine line between, really high conflict that escalates and actual family violence, and there needs to be, really thorough fact finding and investigation of any allegations of abuse or of violence. But the key here is this word rebuttable in both cases. That, well, first of all, with 50% of family violence occurring after separation, during and after, adversarial kind of proceedings, that tells us that those cases, if shared parenting was ordered right away, and if that was established as the foundation of family law, you would prevent violence in those cases. And neither children nor parents would be at risk. Um, and thus, um, saying that shared parenting, legal presumption, is a really good idea is kind of paramount. But that's rebuttable in cases where family violence preceded the court proceedings. That is, that family violence was an issue of concern in the past. In those cases, there's a rebuttable presumption against shared parenting. However, I use the word rebuttable again here because it may be that there was an incident of violence in the past in which the perpetrator has taken responsibility, sought treatment and support. The victim of violence has a support system in place, and the issue of violence has been addressed sufficiently so that shared parenting is um, a realistic and viable consideration. So in those cases, with safety measures in place, specialized interventions in place, like ongoing support to the family, therapeutic family mediation, family coordination program, parenting coordination programs, maybe parallel parenting where parents don't have to have any direct interaction with each other. Then you can establish safety in cases of historical family violence that enable shared parenting. And the conference talked about just how important it is to develop policies and guidelines regarding co-parenting. In the context of family violence, we talked about, first of all, the need for education and training of mental health and legal practitioners in regard to abuse in intimate relationships and consequences for shared parenting, um, skills to screen for abuse and assess safety risks, um, and yeah, um, just what kind of interventions can enable shared parenting where violence has in the past been an issue of concern but is no longer, but also the need for more discussion and policy and development in the area of alternatives to shared parenting in cases of family violence. Because if you can completely exclude a parent from the life of a child um, without any sort of measures in place, support systems in place for both the perpetrator and the victim, then you may be further endangering the well-being of the child and the victimized parent if you don't have kind of those kinds of measures in place. So yeah, it's not always that clear cut, but shared parenting is very instrumental as a in regard to preventing first time family violence, and also maybe a consideration where the violence issue has been addressed directly. The perpetrator has taken responsibility for his or her behavior. Safety measures are firmly in place, and there's close monitoring of the family to enable shared parenting. It's not absolutely ruled out in all cases, but definitely you want to take a cautious approach where family violence has been an issue of concern, and those cases would be excluded from an automatic kind of order of shared parenting to be in place. And we need to recognize parental alienation as a form of family violence, which it is.
Yeah, I definitely want to address that. But so I just want to make sure that I heard you right. You had stated that if shared parenting was enacted in every state, that we would reduce 50% of domestic violence that occurs during divorce.
Yeah, I'd be a little bit cautious to kind of say it quite that strongly. Just to clarify, I would say 50% of first-time violence occurs during kind of this uh, within the context of an adversarial fight over the parenting of children. Okay, so these are cases where there had been no family violence in the past, first time family violence. The great majority of those, definitely, if you had a shared parenting law in place, um, things would not escalate to the point of extremely high conflict leading to violence within that adversarial context. I'm not saying that 100% of those cases, but I'd say the great majority of those cases definitely you would be it would be an effective means of preventing first-time family violence, because you're removing um, that threat of losing your children, and you're ensuring that each parent has an important role to play in their children's lives, that they don't have to protect, don't have to fight, don't have to, the conflict does not have to escalate.
Yeah, that certainly reducing that conflict, I think, would be key in a lot of cases. I want to unpack a little bit before we talk about parental alienation. Let's talk a little bit about false allegations, because that's certainly something, it's deemed the magic bullet that comes up in custody cases quite often.
Yeah.
And did the conference address that issue? And what are your thoughts on false allegations, and what should courts do with people? I mean, obviously you have to take the allegation seriously, but when they're found false, then, and is that also a form of abuse?
Absolutely. Both false allegations and false denials, they both occur, and they're both serious problems. False allegations also because, yes, um, they're a way of removing a fit and loving parent from the life of a child. And so you're denying a child kind of a loving relationship. It also kind of trivializes the matter. If people are just freely alleging abuse in an effort to win their case in family court without any consequences, that kind of diminishes or trivializes those situations where abuse is actually occurring. Courts become cynical. Well, yes, this is typical. So there could be situations where there's actual abuse, and if there's this assumption, well, most of these cases are false allegations, then those actual cases are missed. The key, I think, is to regard allegations of abuse as a serious criminal law matter, where there needs to be really in-depth fact-finding investigation. It should be treated very seriously. And in fact, if it's absolutely apparent that a false allegation has occurred, it's more likely to be detected within a criminal law setting. First of all, if criminal law took it seriously, the incidence of false allegations would diminish, definitely, because there would be recognition that this is going to be investigated. You can't just make an allegation and have it being believed by a family court judge, which is which is what's taking place now. But also that there would be consequences. It's a form of mischief, really, because it has serious consequences to falsely allege. Um, but you also have the issue of false denials that I think you can't overlook, where quite often people will allege abuse when they themselves are the perpetrators of violence, and just outright deny. It often becomes a case in family court, especially, of who mounts the stronger case in that adversarial proceeding, who has the more kind of convincing lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
and has the financial resources to make that case. There's a lot of false allegation going on, but also a lot of false denials. Um, and family law, the family law system, family court is not the venue to determine whether or not abuse and family violence has occurred. It's a criminal matter and should be treated as such.
Yeah, certainly. I think if the courts treated false allegations and perjury as a criminal matter, then people in court will be a lot more cautious about throwing out those allegations, just to win their case, because there would definitely be some consequences, for doing that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yes, and that's, I kind of look at it. We need sort of a four-tier system: legal presumption of shared parenting, rebuttable in cases of violence. Secondly, kind of a network of, I'd say, therapeutic programs that are meant to support people who are in the transition from being, a two-parent family to co-parenting in two different households. Thirdly, kind of prevention programs where people are oriented to the needs of children and families and different co-parenting arrangements and possibilities. And fourthly is that enforcement pillar, where yeah, legal consequences for these types of things like false allegations and false denials are firmly in place.
Well, I think that's a good segue to talk about parental alienation because that's another topic which, I believe would benefit from some criminal aspect to it because I think a lot of people abuse the system and the system lets them get away. But so talk to us a little bit about parental alienation. What's your thoughts on it, and how should it be handled, between the parties and by the courts?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of controversy about this, the whole concept of parental alienation, but it's largely driven by what I would call the divorce industry that has a stake in kind of maintaining the status quo, the legal status quo above everything else, because there are well over 1,200 research projects that have been published in peer-reviewed journals and books on the topic of parental alienation. We know a great deal about parental alienation in regard to the incidence being way higher than we imagined it to be. The consequences being so devastating, not only for the targeted parent of the alienation, but the child who comes eventually to hate him or herself, um, and really feels, like they've betrayed a parent, even though they're kind of brainwashed into hating a parent. Yeah, all kinds of myths and misperceptions again surrounding parental alienation, as really being a matter of children having valid reasons for hating a parent. You don't see children who are actually abused behaving the way that alienated children do. They're very very determined to cut off their relationship with the targeted parent. They're very much parroting the viewpoints of the alienating parent. We know a lot about the behaviors and tactics of alienating parent, which is those tactics are very similar to those of parents who demonstrate other forms of family violence. Um, but yeah, it's a situation. It's first and foremost, I think, a situation of emotional child abuse that often is linked with other forms of child abuse. These parents have a total disregard for the needs and well-being of their children. They're more interested in finding ways of hurting the other parent, using the children to hurt the other parent, than they are focused on children's well-being and children's needs. I think one thing that we don't often recognize is that we tend to blame parents, and I think parents do, should be held accountable for these alienating behaviors. But at the same time, their behaviors are often rewarded within an adversarial legal context, which pits parents against each other and almost rewards them for being aggressive and adversarial and mounting the stronger case in a custody proceeding. It sets them up for alienation and rewards that behavior. So, we've got a system of collective child abuse almost happening in that regard. And just, yeah, again, I think we need a law reform in this area, recognition of parental alienation as a form of violence and abuse, child protection authorities becoming involved and recognizing this as a form of child abuse. We're kind of at a point today where we were 100 years ago with respect to physical and sexual abuse of children. There was widespread denial. It's occurring now with parental alienation and emotional child abuse in general. There's a lot of kind of underreporting of that. We don't take that as seriously as other forms of abuse, and yet it has kind of devastating outcomes. We need more emphasis on treatment programs, reunification programs for parents who've been and children who have been separated from each other, and of course we need legal enforcement of co-parenting and shared parenting orders where parents don't abide by that and are still trying to alienate their children. But again, I think there's a case to be made for shared parenting in family law here, because a shared parenting law we've seen in those jurisdictions where shared parenting is the law, is the foundation of family law and the default position, that rates of parental alienation are much, much less. Yeah, people are not set up to kind of denigrate each other. Parents won't denigrate each other when they know that the outcome is going to be shared parenting. There's no need to attempt alienation strategies in a way to kind of win your case in court.
And I know there's this stuff all exists on a spectrum, and I think what I've seen reported in the past is you sort of have these parents that are unknowingly alienating their children through sort of bad behavior because they're very emotional about the divorce and things like that, and then you have those parents that are intentionally alienating their children. They're going way out of their way to to make the children hate the other parent. And is that something that's sort of distinguishable in a easily distinguishable in a court case, or are there some measures for those sorts of things?
I think it is more distinguishable than we may recognize. And I've always said, by look at people's actual behaviors in these cases where people's intention and action, parents' intentions and actions clearly are meant to completely eradicate the child's relationship with the other parent, where in fact there's total denial of any kind of contact. Clearly, that's a very severe form of parental alienation. There hasn't been enough research on those severe cases. But when outright contact refusal is the tactic, then you've got a very, very serious form of alienation. When that occurs in the absence of any kind of evidence of the target parents mistreatment of the child or any valid reason for the child rejecting that parent.
So we're kind of running towards the end of our time here. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
Well, no, other than, I really admire and support the work of the National Parents Association, there, which is a partner and very involved in the kind of international shared parenting movement with the International Council on Shared Parenting. I would really encourage your listeners to kind of keep an ear out for our future conferences. The one in Vancouver, I thought was our most successful by far. This is an international kind of social movement, and that has made some really strong gains. In Europe, for example, the Council of Europe voted almost unanimously to establish shared parenting as the foundation of family law some years ago, and that's largely due to the efforts of shared parenting scholars and advocates. So, yeah, so there's definitely a paradigm shift going on, and we see that in the States, especially with more progressive legislators and legislatures establishing shared parenting as the foundation of family law.
Well, fantastic. And Dr. Kruk, I want to thank you for joining us today. And you write a column for Psychology Today, right?
Yes, co-parenting after divorce. So I kind of address the full range of issues. Particularly, it's directed not only at professionals but parents themselves. So have a look at that.
And let's see. And how often do those articles come out?
Well, usually about once a month. Yeah, it depends. Once every month or two that I kind of have a column. Most recently, my columns have focused on this issue of the intersection of shared parenting and family violence.
Fantastic. And if people need to get a hold of you, where can they do that at?
Okay, well, I can be reached by email, edward.kruk@ubc.ca. I'm on faculty at the University of British Columbia, so I can be contacted that way.
Well, fantastic. I certainly want to thank you for joining us today, and a lot of really great information. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we could dig into and unpack, and in future episodes if you'd like to.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for the opportunity. It's great.